All right, so are you ready to dive in? Today we're tackling something I know a lot of you struggle with, and that's speaking English fluently.
Okay.
We're going to be going after those pauses.
Yeah.
Little pauses and hesitations that can really disrupt the flow when you're trying to speak.
Right.
We've got a whole bunch of research and tips and even some linguistic theories. We're going to unpack it all.
Yeah, it's interesting because, we aim for this like smooth speech when we're talking.
Yeah.
But actually, a lot of times the real hurdles are more mental.
Yeah.
It's not always that we don't know the right word,
Right.
but we can't access it fast enough
Right.
to keep that flow going.
Yes, and it's so frustrating.
Yeah.
It's like when you're trying to remember someone's name and it's right there, but you can't get it.
Exactly.
Yeah. So let's get to the bottom of this. What are some of the common culprits behind these speaking hookups?
Well, a major one, especially if you're actively learning English, is vocabulary gaps. I mean, it might seem obvious, but if you don't know the right word, that can totally throw a wrench in the works. And it goes beyond just single words, too, if you're not familiar with common collocations.
Collocations?
Yeah.
Can you break that down for our listeners? What are those?
Sure. Collocations are basically words that just naturally go together.
Okay.
So, for example, we say heavy rain, not strong rain.
Right.
Or we make a decision, not take a decision. So these pairings might seem kind of random, but mastering them is really key for fluency.
So it's not just about the words themselves, but like how they fit together.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, but what about those times when you do know the words, but you still find yourself like stumbling? What's happening there?
So often that comes down to the mental process of translation. So you're not thinking directly in English.
Right.
Instead, your brain's working overtime trying to convert your thoughts back and forth from your native language.
Yeah.
So that mental gymnastics is what's taking the time.
I can totally relate to that.
Sure, yeah.
When I was learning Spanish, I used to get stuck translating entire sentences in my head.
Yeah.
And it was so exhausting.
Right.
It made my speech so choppy.
Yeah, it sounds really unnatural, too.
Right.
Yeah.
So how do we break free from this mental translation trap?
One strategy is to think in phrases instead of single words. This helps group ideas together and creates a smoother flow. It's like learning a song on the piano. You don't focus on every single note. You think about the chords and the progressions.
That's a really interesting analogy.
Yeah.
So I'm starting to see how shifting from that word by word to more phrase-based could help.
Exactly. And this is where those collocations come in handy.
Right.
Because if you've already internalized those phrases, then you're not constructing sentences from scratch every time.
Got it.
Yeah.
That's super helpful. So we've talked about vocabulary gaps. Talked about mental translation.
Right.
Are there other sneaky saboteurs we should be on the lookout for?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Let's talk about confidence or actually lack of it.
Okay.
Because the fear of making mistakes, that can be incredibly paralyzing.
It really can.
And so you start to overthink and second guess yourself.
Yeah.
And that's when you hesitate.
You freeze up.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like being put on the spot, in class.
Exactly.
When you don't know the answer. But isn't some self-critique necessary?
Of course.
To get better right?
Yeah.
How do we balance that with not just being completely paralyzed?
So it's about perspective.
Okay.
Instead of viewing mistakes as failures, see them as opportunities to learn.
Okay.
Every error is a chance to refine your skills.
So embracing the imperfections and trusting that with practice, those pauses will decrease.
Exactly. And it's really about focusing on communication more than grammatical perfection. Because even native speakers make mistakes all the time.
Oh, yeah, all the time.
But we just keep talking.
Right.
We clarify, and the conversation moves on.
So it's not about being flawless.
Yeah.
It's about getting your message across.
Exactly.
What about when grammar itself becomes the stumbling block? Like when you're trying to think of how to conjugate that verb or the right preposition
I know.
before you even open your mouth.
That can trip you up.
Yeah.
It's important to remember that fluent speech is more about the rhythm and flow than perfect accuracy in every sentence.
Okay.
So if you overthink the grammar, you actually sound less natural.
Almost like if you think about the steps too much when you're dancing.
Right.
You'll never look graceful.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance between accuracy and spontaneity.
Right.
And as you get more experience, the rules will become more intuitive.
Okay.
And then you can just focus on the message.
That makes sense.
Uh,
This is incredibly insightful. I feel like we've uncovered a lot of these fluency saboteurs.
yeah.
Vocabulary gaps, mental translation, confidence, even just overthinking grammar rules. I'm already starting to rethink my own approach to speaking English.
Good.
So how do we combat these villains?
Okay.
What are some practical strategies to minimize those pauses?
Well, one of the most effective, and we touched on it earlier, is mastering the art of thinking and speaking in phrases,
Okay.
not individual words.
This is where it gets really interesting.
Yes.
Can you elaborate on how we can actively train ourselves to think in phrases?
Sure.
Like what specific types of phrases should we be focusing on?
So it's understanding these building blocks of fluent speech.
Okay.
So in addition to collocations, you have phrasal verbs.
Okay.
These are verbs combined with prepositions or adverbs that create a new meaning, like look up or put up with. And then there are idioms, which are expressions that can't be taken literally, like kick the bucket or piece of cake.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's like equipping yourself with this toolbox of ready-made phrases.
Exactly.
That you can use in different situations.
Yeah.
But how do we build this toolbox?
You don't have to memorize everything at once.
Okay, good.
It's about incorporating these gradually into your everyday speech and writing.
Gotcha.
Notice how native speakers use them in conversation, movies, or books. Try using a new phrase each day.
So it's more about observation than memorization.
Exactly.
I like that approach.
Yeah.
It feels much less daunting.
Right.
But what about those moments where, even with our toolbox, we still get stuck?
Yeah.
What are some quick fixes to avoid those silences?
Sentence starters can be really helpful.
Sentence starters.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So these are prefabricated launching pads for your thoughts.
Okay.
So think of phrases like, I believe that, or from my perspective, or one thing to consider is having these ready eliminates that initial hesitation. So you can gather your thoughts.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. So it's like a cheat sheet.
In a way.
For starting conversations.
Yeah.
But wouldn't that make us sound robotic?
The goal is not to become overly reliant on them, but to use them strategically.
Right.
It's like training wheels on a bike. They help you until you can ride on your own.
I see, I see.
Yeah.
So it's a tool to build fluency, not a crutch.
Exactly.
Okay. And eventually, as you get more comfortable, you'll naturally rely on them less and less.
Yes.
Okay. So we've talked about vocabulary, mental translation, confidence, even grammar rules. We've talked about phrases and sentence starters.
Right.
I feel like we've covered a lot.
Yes.
But there's one more I think we need to address before we move on.
Okay.
And those are the dreaded filler words.
Yes, those ums and ahs.
Right.
You know,
they get such a bad rap.
They do.
But I'm curious to hear what you have to say because I thought those were the things we were trying to avoid.
Well, you know that it can actually be your friends.
Wait, what?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really? How?
If you use them wisely,
okay,
they can act as little bridges between your thoughts.
Right.
And that prevents those awkward silences.
Okay.
They signal to the listener that you're still processing.
Right.
You haven't lost your train of thought.
So it's not about eliminating them entirely.
Yeah.
It's about being more conscious.
Exactly.
About how we use them.
Yeah.
And moderation, of course.
Of course.
But can you give us some examples of how to use them effectively?
Yeah. So instead of just, you could say, well, let me see, or that's a good question. Let me think for a moment. So it adds a little substance.
Right.
And buys you some time.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
This is a game changer.
I feel like we've given fillers a redemption arc.
Yeah.
We've debunked some myths and explored the mental blocks that cause pauses and even started building our fluency toolkit.
Yeah.
It's been an incredibly insightful journey so far.
Good.
I'm excited to keep going.
Great. Me too. So let's shift gears a little bit and explore some practical techniques.
Yeah, let's get practical.
Yeah, that can help you like bridge those vocabulary gaps and navigate those moments when the right word just vanishes.
Please, give us the tools.
Okay, so one technique that I find really effective is called circumlocution.
Circumlocution.
Yeah, it's a fancy word.
It sounds fancy.
It is, but it's a simple concept.
Okay.
Basically, it means describing something using other words.
Okay.
When you can't remember the exact term.
Got it. So can you give me like for instance?
Yeah.
In a conversation.
Sure.
Okay. Let's say you're trying to Describe a movie you saw,
Okay.
but you can't remember the word suspenseful.
Instead of like getting flustered and stuck,
Right.
you could say, it was a movie that kept me on the edge of my seat. I was constantly wondering what would happen next.
So instead of getting hung up on the one word,
Yeah.
you're kind of painting a picture with words.
Exactly.
Okay.
And the beauty of this is that it not only helps you avoid those awkward silences,
Right.
but it also forces you to think creatively.
Right.
And use different vocabulary.
So it's like a win-win.
It is.
Yeah, you get your point across.
Yeah.
And you expand your vocabulary at the same time.
Exactly.
I love it. Okay, but what about those times when even describing the word feels impossible?
Mm-hmm.
Are there other strategies we can use?
Of course.
Okay.
Sometimes a simple gesture or visual cue can do the trick.
Right.
Like, let's say you're trying to explain tall,
Okay.
but you just can't remember the word.
Yeah.
You could simply point upwards or use your hands
Okay.
to indicate height.
It's just like playing charades.
Yeah, exactly.
I never thought about using nonverbal communication as a fluency tool.
Yeah, it can be helpful.
That's really cool. Now, you mentioned this earlier. What about accents?
Uh-huh.
Do they play a role in perceived fluency?
Well, accents themselves don't hinder fluency,
Right.
but they can sometimes lead to misunderstandings.
Sure.
Or mispronunciations,
Okay.
which obviously can disrupt the flow.
Right. So it's important to be aware
Yes.
of how your accent might be perceived
Yeah,
and to work on your pronunciation if needed.
exactly. And this is where focusing on clear articulation and practicing the sounds that are specific to English can be really helpful.
And there are lots of resources available to do that.
There are.
Okay, so we've talked about vocabulary gaps, mental blocks, even accents.
Yeah.
I feel like we're chipping away at all these fluency fears.
Oh, yeah.
But let's talk about some exercises.
Okay.
What are some specific exercises our listeners can do to boost their fluency?
One that I highly recommend is called shadowing.
Shadow.
Yes. It basically involves listening to a native English speaker
Okay.
and trying to mimic their speech as closely as possible.
So like copying.
Yeah. Not just the words, but like the rhythm,
Well,
the intonation, even the pauses.
So like becoming a vocal chameleon.
Yes.
Blending in with the natural flow of English.
Right. And the beauty of it is you can do it with anything you enjoy listening to. Like podcasts,
Yeah.
audiobooks, movies, even, this very episode.
I bet you could shadow us right now.
You could.
It'd be like a real-time fluency workout.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, but how do you actually practice shadowing effectively?
Well, it can be as simple or as complex as you want it to be.
Okay.
You can start by just focusing on the overall rhythm and intonation, and then gradually work your way up to like individual sounds and words.
So like small chunks.
Yeah. You can even record yourself shadowing and then listen back
Right.
to identify areas to improve.
That's a really good tip. It's like having your own fluency coach right there in your pocket.
Exactly.
You mentioned recording earlier.
Yeah.
How can recording ourselves help?
So recording yourself speaking,
Uh-huh.
whether it's reading a passage
Okay.
or having a conversation or even just thinking out loud, can be incredibly revealing.
It can be a little scary,
It can be.
but I can see how it would be valuable.
Yes, because you become more aware of your speech patterns,
Right.
like those hesitations,
Mm-hmm.
fillers, or areas where your pronunciation might be off.
So it's like holding up a mirror to yourself.
Exactly.
But don't just listen for the mistakes, right?
Right. Pay attention to the overall flow and rhythm.
Okay.
Are you speaking too fast or too slow?
Right.
Are you stressing the right words?
Yeah.
Are your sentences well structured?
So it's like becoming a detective
Yeah.
of your own speech.
Right.
Okay. I like that. What other exercises do you recommend?
Another fun one is tongue twisters.
Tongue twisters.
Yes. They might seem silly.
Yeah. I used to do those as a kid.
Right.
I always ended up in a fit of giggles.
They're fun.
I could see how they'd be really helpful
Yeah.
for training your mouth to make the sounds.
Exactly. They're great for pronunciation.
Okay.
Articulation and breath control.
So we've got shadowing, recording ourselves tongue twisters.
Yes.
It's like building an arsenal of fluency-boosting weapons.
Exactly.
But beyond those exercises, what's the most important thing?
Well, the most crucial element, and it might seem obvious, is to just speak.
Okay.
Speak, speak, speak.
Yeah, practice makes perfect, right?
It does.
But how do we create more opportunities to speak?
Get creative.
Okay.
You can join a language exchange group, attend online events, start a conversation with a stranger at a coffee shop.
If you're feeling brave.
If you're feeling brave.
Okay.
Or even just narrate your day to yourself in English.
Right.
Make it part of your daily routine.
I love that. Finding little moments throughout the day to immerse yourself.
Exactly.
Okay. But is there such a thing as too much practice?
That's a good question.
Can you overdo it?
Like with any skill, you need balance.
Yeah.
So consistent practice is important.
Right.
But you also don't want to burn yourself out.
Right.
So listen to your body and your mind.
Okay.
If you're feeling overwhelmed, take a break.
Good advice.
And then come back to it later.
It should be enjoyable.
It should.
So what's the biggest misconception people have about fluency?
Well, one of the most common is that fluency is like a destination.
Okay.
A finish line you cross.
Oh.
But in reality, it's an ongoing journey.
Okay.
It's a process of continuous growth and refinement.
So it's not about being perfect.
Yeah.
It's about embracing the journey.
Exactly.
Okay.
And the beauty is it's uniquely yours.
Right.
There's no one-size-fits-all approach.
That makes sense.
It's about finding what works for you, experimenting and celebrating your progress.
That's a wonderful way to look at it.
Yeah.
Takes the pressure off.
It does.
Allows us to enjoy the process.
Right.
Okay, well, I think we've covered a lot of ground here.
Yeah.
When it comes to techniques and exercises.
We have.
I'm feeling really inspired
Good.
to start putting all of this into action.
Great.
But before we move on to our final thoughts,
Okay.
I'm curious from your experience, what's the most rewarding aspect of becoming more fluent in another language?
For me, it's the connections you can make.
Okay.
Being able to communicate with people from different cultures.
Right.
To share ideas and experiences.
Yeah.
It really opens up a whole new world.
It really does.
And it can be incredibly enriching.
Absolutely. That's a perfect point to transition into our final thoughts for this deep dive on fluency. So we've been on quite a journey.
Yeah.
Exploring these fluency saboteurs and
Right.
equipping ourselves with all these tools and techniques.
Yeah.
To battle those pauses. But I'm curious, what's the ultimate sign that someone's cracked the fluency can?
Yeah.
How do you know when you've truly arrived?
That's a great question. And, for me, true fluency goes beyond just speaking without pauses.
Okay.
It's about effortlessness.
Effortlessness.
Yeah, where the language becomes an extension of your thoughts.
Okay.
It just flows naturally.
That sounds almost magical.
It kind of is.
Can you give us an example?
Yeah, so imagine you're having a conversation.
Okay.
And you're not translating in your head anymore.
Right.
The words just flow effortlessly. And you can really be present in the moment.
Right.
You can connect with people on a deeper level.
Wow, that's beautiful. It's like the language itself disappears.
It does.
And what's left is just pure connection.
Yes, exactly.
So how do we even begin to approach that level
Right.
of effortlessness? Is it something people are just born with?
I truly believe that fluency is a skill that can be developed no matter your background or natural abilities.
Okay.
It really comes down to consistent effort, a willingness to embrace those imperfections,
Right.
and a genuine passion for the language.
So it's not about being some kind of language genius.
No, not at all.
It's about the hard work
Yeah.
and the right mindset.
Exactly.
But I have to admit, that idea of achieving effortlessness,
Yeah,
it feels a little daunting.
it can.
What advice would you give to someone who's feeling kind of overwhelmed by that?
Well, remember that fluency is not a linear process.
Okay.
There are going to be ups and downs. Times of frustration where you feel like you're not making progress.
Right.
But it's so important to celebrate those small victories.
Okay.
You acknowledge how far you've come.
Right.
And keep that vision of effortless communication in mind.
So focusing on the progress, not the perfection.
Exactly.
Embracing the journey with all of its stumbles.
Yes, and remember, it's a lifelong endeavor. Even native speakers are constantly, evolving their language skills.
Right.
Adapting to new contexts, expanding their vocabulary.
Yeah.
So the joy really is in that journey, the constant discovery and the connections that you make along the way.
That's a really beautiful way to put it.
Thank you.
I think that takes a lot of pressure off.
Yeah.
And reminds us that it's a gift.
It is.
This journey of learning a language.
Absolutely.
Well, with that, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive
Okay.
into the world of fluency.
Yeah.
But before we say goodbye, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about.
Okay.
So imagine you're in a situation where you need to communicate in English.
Okay.
Maybe it's a presentation or a job interview or even just a casual conversation with some new friends.
Okay.
But this time, there's no hesitation.
Right.
No fumbling for words. You're not afraid. The words, they just flow naturally. You express yourself with confidence and clarity.
Right.
And you connect with the people you're talking to on a much deeper level.
Yeah.
How does that feel? What new possibilities open up for you when you can communicate like that?
That's a good question for everyone to consider.
Yeah. Take a moment and visualize that scenario.
Right.
Let that feeling fuel your journey towards fluency.
I love that.
Remember, fluency is not a destination. It's an ongoing journey.
Right.
So embrace the challenges, celebrate your progress.
Absolutely.
And most importantly, enjoy the ride.
Yes. Enjoy it. It's been an absolute pleasure exploring all this with you.
Likewise, thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
And a huge thank you to all of our listeners for joining us on this deep dive into fluency.
Hey.
See you next time.